So these guidelines adopted by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, guidelines on access to information and elections in Africa, serve to be a set of principles around which national constituencies and national legal systems have to organize themselves in terms of what needs to be available to anyone who needs to be voting in elections and participating in elections. So the premise really is that much of the problems that we've experienced in relation to elections in Africa, disputes, violence, conflict, many of these problems relate back to a lack of a free flow of information, a shroud of secrecy that hangs over our elections. So the guidelines set standards about what everyone needs to know in, during, and even before the times of elections. It covers a number of stakeholders. It's not only the body that monitors the election, but also the political parties, civil society, and the media, for example, that need to proactively disclose. In other words, they need to disclose information, make it available as a matter of routine without anyone needing to request or require that information. That is the essence of what these guidelines require. Now, the guidelines, in a sense, relate to another set of standards that the Commission had adopted, which is this model law on access to information. The model law talks of access to information more generally. It requires, on the one hand, a state to have a system in place that proactively disclose as much of the information available to the state and private parties as possible. But then, if the information is not provided, that there would be a system in terms of which one could request information from information holders. The guidelines, in essence, builds on the model law because it spells out exactly what the content is of the proactive disclosure in respect of elections in African countries. And one hopes, the Commission anticipates, that if this is realized, that domestic constituencies would use the guidelines and have a dialogue and ensure that these principles are being adhered to in the upcoming elections, that will curb these problems that we've seen in the past of disputed elections with conflicts arising therefrom.
With regards to access to information for people with disabilities, there has been a number of challenges that we have encountered in Zimbabwe, where issues of inaccessibility have been the major barrier as we try to access information from whether it's public or private bodies. The issues of accessible formats has played the central role when it comes to the inaccessibility of information for people with disabilities. For instance, when it comes to elections, there are many issues that a person should know about, whether it's candidates or the policies of a particular political party and such other issues, which have remained difficult, I should say, for people with disabilities to access. But we have made efforts in terms of advocacy to push public bodies like the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission and other players within the electoral process to provide people with disabilities with accessible information, whether it's braille pamphlets, whether it's sign language interpretation during public relations events for electoral commissions and other such other bodies, even political parties. And this is, as we saw in the 2018 elections, is started to bear fruits because many organizations, that is political organizations and other players within the electoral process, now are recognizing that it is essential for people with disabilities to also access information when it comes to electoral issues. There's a challenge in most instances where it is assumed that making information accessible for people with disabilities is an expensive endeavor. But when we, as far as institutions, when we ensure that the information is made accessible right from the designing process, make it universally accessible right from the designing of whatever information packages, then that cuts all the costs, and that is what we have been pushing for. So I think with those few words, I think that's fine.
Community radios play a very critical role in terms of promoting access to information and freedom of expression, particularly during election times. And this is especially so in rural communities, where communities are marginalized in terms of accessing information, where mainstream media is also is not accessing many people. So community radio plays a very critical role in terms of even sharing basic information pre-election period, during election and post-election. Pre-election, especially during the last election, where there was a new way of registering for elections, the BVA era. The community radio was playing a very important facilitator role of demystifying and explaining, simplifying things in local languages. I think you appreciate that most of the things that have to do with elections, the way they are communicated is that they are communicated in foreign languages, including English. And community radio simplify those things and put them in local languages where people can understand. So community radio plays a critical role in enhancing access to information. And it also assists in terms of enhancing interaction between candidates and citizens, so that candidates are not just organizing rallies, but they are put to test where they are interrogated by citizens in terms of their manifesto and their election promise, so that citizens will be able then to follow up after election. So as we are speaking, community radios are playing a very critical role also in engaging those candidates who were successful, so that they can demand in terms of delivery of the promise that they made before elections. And I also want to say that community radio are playing that role of sustained engagement, citizen engagement with the process.